When we examine the moral confusion that pervades contemporary discourse, we discover a paradox that would have astonished the ancients. The very progress that promised to liberate humanity from superstition has instead unleashed a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Through decades of teaching at Chicago and wrestling with the great texts, I've observed how modernity's rejection of classical foundations has created not enlightenment, but a profound disorientation about fundamental questions of right and wrong. Today, we shall explore the hidden mechanisms by which modern thought systematically dismantled the moral architecture that had sustained Western civilization for millennia. The diagnosis requires us to read between the lines of both ancient wisdom and modern innovation, discovering how the apparent triumph of reason paradoxically produced its opposite, the inability to distinguish between noble and base, just and unjust, worthy and unworthy of human pursuit. This investigation will reveal that our contemporary crisis is not accidental but the inevitable consequence of philosophical errors whose roots extend deep into the foundations of modern thought itself. Chapter 1: The Classical Architecture of Moral Knowledge. The classical understanding of morality rested upon a fundamental premise that modernity finds intolerable: the existence of an objective moral order accessible to human reason yet independent of human will. When we read Aristotle's Ethics with sufficient care, we discover that virtue is not merely conventional but natural, rooted in the permanent structure of the human soul and its relationship to the cosmic order. The ancients understood that moral knowledge differs qualitatively from technical knowledge precisely because it concerns the whole human being in relation to the highest things. This classical framework provided what we might call a moral compass, through its recognition of natural hierarchy among goods, purposes, and ways of life. The philosophical life occupied the summit not through arbitrary preference but through rational demonstration of its superiority in actualizing human potential. Below this peak, political virtue held its proper place, followed by the various forms of technical competence and, finally, the life devoted purely to pleasure or accumulation. This hierarchy was not imposed from without but discovered through careful examination of human nature and its proper development. The Platonic understanding went even deeper, recognizing that moral education requires a gradual turning of the soul from shadows toward reality. The famous allegory of the cave illustrates how most human beings mistake appearances for truth, requiring philosophical midwifery to assist in their liberation. Yet this liberation cannot be forced, it must be voluntary and proceed according to the natural development of rational capacity. The philosopher king represents not tyrannical imposition of truth but the possibility of rule guided by genuine knowledge of justice. Aristotelian practical wisdom, phronesis, provided the methodological foundation for moral reasoning that avoided both rigid legalism and arbitrary subjectivism. The doctrine of the mean showed how virtue requires situational judgment that applies universal principles to particular circumstances while maintaining objective standards. This approach recognized that moral action occurs in the realm of the particular and contingent, yet without abandoning the possibility of rational evaluation. Modern thought began its assault on this edifice through seemingly reasonable objections. How can we be certain about these alleged natural standards? Doesn't historical investigation reveal the conventional character of moral beliefs? The moderns presented themselves as more honest, more scientific, more willing to acknowledge human limitations. Yet their critique contained a fatal flaw that careful reading exposes. It confused the difficulty of moral knowledge with its impossibility, and the variety of moral opinions with the absence of moral truth. The historical school, from Vico through Marx to contemporary historicism, argued that all human thought is conditioned by historical circumstances. This insight, initially liberating, became tyrannical when extended to claim that moral and political standards themselves are merely historical products. The relativistic conclusion followed with apparent logical necessity: if all moral beliefs are historically conditioned, none can claim objective validity. The ancient confidence in natural right gave way to the modern dogma of historical relativism, setting the stage for the moral chaos we observe today. Chapter 2: The Historicist Revolution and its Hidden Contradictions. The historicist argument appears persuasive until we examine its hidden contradictions with hermeneutical suspicion. If all human thought is historically conditioned, then historicism itself must be historically conditioned, a product of modern circumstances rather than timeless truth. The historicists claim universal validity for their doctrine of historical relativity, thereby contradicting their own fundamental premise. This logical inconsistency signals a deeper problem: the confusion between recognizing historical variety and accepting complete relativity. When we trace this development through the great figures, Hegel's historical dialectic, Marx's material conditions, Weber's value neutrality, we observe how each step appeared to advance human understanding while actually undermining the possibility of rational moral judgment. Hegel's insight into the historical development of consciousness became a prison when absolute knowledge was located in historical process rather than eternal truth. Marx's materialist inversion promised scientific precision in understanding social development but reduced moral and political questions to economic determinism. Weber's attempt to establish value-neutral social science represented the culmination of this trajectory. By insisting on the separation of facts from values, Weber believed he could preserve scientific objectivity while acknowledging the irreducible plurality of value systems. Yet this apparent solution concealed a deeper problem. If values cannot be rationally evaluated, then the choice of values becomes arbitrary, and social science itself loses its claim to promote human flourishing through better understanding. The sociological method, treating moral beliefs as objects of scientific study rather than claims to truth, systematically destroys the very capacity for moral discrimination. Scientists can analyze moral beliefs, measure their social effects, trace their historical development, but science qua science cannot evaluate their validity. This methodological restriction might seem harmless until we recognize its practical consequences. It renders impossible the very moral reasoning upon which decent political life depends. The consequences of this intellectual revolution extend far beyond academic philosophy. When moral standards lose their claim to objective validity, political authority becomes problematic. Classical political philosophy understood government as serving natural human purposes, promoting virtue, enabling flourishing, protecting justice. But if these purposes are merely conventional, political authority reduces to mere power. The state can no longer appeal to justice to legitimize its actions, it can only appeal to consent, utility, or force. Modern democratic theory attempts to solve this problem through procedural legitimacy. Governments derive authority from proper procedures rather than substantive justice. Yet this solution merely postpones the fundamental question: why should anyone accept these procedures rather than others? Without appeal to natural standards of justice, procedural legitimacy becomes circular. We ought to follow these procedures because we have agreed to follow them. The ultimate foundation dissolves into arbitrary will. This dissolution explains the moral paralysis we observe in contemporary political discourse. When fundamental moral questions arise, about war, abortion, euthanasia, economic justice, modern societies lack shared rational criteria for resolution. Public discourse degenerates into competing assertions of personal preference or group interest, each claiming equal validity. The result is not enlightened democracy but sophisticated barbarism disguised as tolerance and openness. Chapter 3: The Tyranny of the Fact-Value Dichotomy. Consider your own education. Were you taught that science provides facts while values represent mere opinion? This apparently reasonable distinction, deeply embedded in modern consciousness, conceals a philosophical revolution whose implications few recognize. The fact-value dichotomy, seemingly neutral and objective, actually embodies a particular metaphysical position that privileges one mode of knowledge while delegitimating others. This dichotomy has become the unexamined orthodoxy of modern intellectual life. yet it rests upon assumptions that cannot survive careful philosophical scrutiny. When Max Weber proclaimed the necessity of value neutrality in social science, he believed he was freeing scholarship from political bias and establishing objective foundations for human understanding. Yet his formulation contained hidden value judgments, that scientific objectivity represents the highest form of knowledge, that values cannot be rationally evaluated, that the scholar's duty requires abstaining from moral judgment. These assumptions themselves reflect moral commitments that cannot be scientifically validated without circularity. The classical tradition recognized no such dichotomy. For Aristotle, practical wisdom, phronesis, represents a form of knowledge as rigorous as theoretical science, though different in character. Moral knowledge concerns human action in particular circumstances, requiring judgment that combines universal principles with contextual understanding. This knowledge is objective, not dependent on arbitrary preference, yet not reducible to mathematical demonstration. The ancients understood that different kinds of objects require different modes of cognition. Modern thought rejected this classical understanding by demanding that all genuine knowledge conform to the mathematical experimental model developed in the natural sciences. Whatever cannot be measured, quantified, and replicated lacks cognitive status. Moral judgments, being qualitative and contextual, fail this test and consequently get relegated to the realm of subjective preference or cultural convention. This relegation appears to honor the methods that produced modern technological success, yet it destroys the possibility of rational discourse about the ends toward which technology should be directed. The consequences for education prove particularly destructive. If moral beliefs are matters of preference, moral education becomes indoctrination, the imposition of arbitrary values upon students who ought to choose freely. Universities increasingly avoid moral questions or treat them as purely subjective, producing graduates who are technically competent but morally confused. Students learn sophisticated methods for achieving goals but receive no guidance about which goals are worthy of achievement. This educational crisis reflects a deeper philosophical confusion about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. Classical education aimed at the formation of character through engagement with the highest questions about human life and its proper ordering. Modern education aims at the acquisition of skills and information without addressing fundamental questions of purpose and meaning. The result is a form of sophisticated ignorance that mistakes technical competence for genuine understanding. The resulting nihilism may remain hidden behind humanitarian rhetoric and procedural correctness, but it manifests in the inability to make rational moral distinctions. When everything becomes a matter of preference, nothing has intrinsic worth. The distinction between noble and base disappears, leaving only the distinction between successful and unsuccessful, powerful and powerless. This reduction of all human differences to differences of power creates the conditions for tyranny even within ostensibly free societies. Chapter 4: The Failure of Modern Moral Reconstruction. Contemporary attempts to restore moral guidance while maintaining modern premises illustrate the inadequacy of halfway measures and the impossibility of having modern conclusions on classical foundations. Liberal theorists like John Rawls seek to ground justice in rational choice behind a veil of ignorance, hoping to derive objective principles from subjective preferences. This ingenious construction appears to solve the problem of moral knowledge by appealing to what rational individuals would choose under conditions of impartiality. Yet this approach already concedes the fundamental modern premise, that we cannot know objective human purposes and must therefore construct artificial foundations for political life. The contractarian tradition, from Hobbes through contemporary libertarians, attempts to derive moral obligations from enlightened self-interest. If individuals can be shown that cooperation serves their interests better than conflict, moral behavior becomes rational calculation rather than mysterious duty. This approach appears to solve the problem of moral knowledge by reducing it to prudential calculation accessible to any rational agent. Yet it founders on the obvious difficulty: why should anyone honor agreements when violation serves their interest? The contractarian must either appeal to external enforcement, which requires prior moral obligations, or assume a moral duty to keep promises, which contradicts the reduction of morality to self-interest. Utilitarian ethics promises scientific precision in moral judgment by reducing all values to a single measure, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This approach appeals to modern sensibilities by appearing objective, egalitarian, and capable of mathematical calculation. Bentham's philosophic calculus promised to resolve moral disputes through empirical measurement of pleasures and pains. Yet utilitarian calculation requires impossible knowledge of consequences and commensurable measures of satisfaction. More fundamentally, it cannot account for the qualitative differences among pleasures and pains that common experience recognizes as morally relevant. Contemporary virtue ethics attempts to revive Aristotelian insights while accommodating modern pluralism and historical consciousness. Philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre diagnose the failure of modern moral philosophy and call for return to tradition-based virtue concepts that provide substantive content for moral reasoning. Yet their solutions typically accept historicist premises about the cultural conditioning of moral traditions, thereby undermining the objective foundations that classical virtue ethics requires. If virtues are culturally relative, the appeal to tradition cannot provide rational grounds for preferring one tradition to another. Rights-based approaches attempt to ground political legitimacy in individual dignity and autonomy, deriving substantive moral constraints from formal respect for persons. This approach appears to honor both individual freedom and objective moral standards while avoiding controversial metaphysical commitments. Yet rights talk proves remarkably empty when pressed for substantive content. Which rights are fundamental? How do we resolve conflicts between competing rights? Without appeal to natural purposes that rights are meant to serve, rights become arbitrary assertions backed by political power. Each of these modern approaches shares a common defect: they attempt to reconstruct moral guidance while accepting the modern rejection of natural teleology. But without natural purposes toward which human action properly aims, moral philosophy becomes either arbitrary construction or sophisticated description of existing preferences. The ancients understood that ethics requires metaphysics, specifically, understanding of human nature and its place in the cosmic order. Modern attempts to avoid this requirement produce elaborate edifices built upon sand. Political philosophy faces parallel difficulties. Liberal democracy promises to solve the problem of political authority through consent and individual rights, yet cannot explain why anyone should respect either consent or rights without appealing to natural standards of justice that liberalism officially rejects. The result is political theory that oscillates between empty formalism and disguised substantive commitments that dare not speak their name. Chapter 5: The Return of the Theological-Political Problem. Consider carefully your own relationship between belief and rational inquiry. Can human reason provide sufficient guidance for life, or does it require supplementation from revelation? This ancient question, which I have called the theological-political problem, takes on new urgency in our secular age precisely because modernity's attempted solutions have proven inadequate. The crisis of secular foundations has created conditions for religious resurgence, yet without the intellectual sophistication necessary to address the fundamental tensions between reason and revelation that careful thought reveals. The classical tradition recognized a permanent tension between philosophy and religion, reason and revelation, that admits no final resolution at the level of human understanding. Maimonides demonstrated how the greatest minds navigate this tension through sophisticated hermeneutics that honor both rational inquiry and divine authority. The Guide for the Perplexed shows how apparent contradictions between philosophical demonstration and scriptural teaching can be resolved through careful attention to different levels of discourse and different audiences. Yet this resolution requires recognizing that complete harmony between reason and revelation may be impossible for finite minds. The Enlightenment project promised to resolve religious conflict through rational religion, reducing revelation to what reason could validate and eliminating sectarian strife through universal rational principles. This approach preserved moral guidance while eliminating the need for faith in particular revelations or submission to ecclesiastical authority. Voltaire's Natural Religion and Jefferson's Rational Christianity exemplify this approach, which appeared to offer the benefits of religion without its intellectual and political dangers. Yet rational religion quickly proved unstable under further questioning. If reason judges revelation, why not dispense with revelation entirely? If universal rational principles suffice for moral guidance, what purpose does particular religious tradition serve? The move from rational religion to secular humanism followed with logical inevitability, as thinkers like Feuerbach and Marx exposed the projection involved in religious belief and called for purely human solutions to human problems. Secular humanism attempts to preserve religious moral insights while rejecting religious metaphysics. Human dignity, equality, and rights receive secular justification through appeals to reason, sentiment, or practical necessity. The democratic faith in human equality and individual worth appears to require no theological support, deriving instead from empirical observation of human capacities and practical requirements of social cooperation. Yet these secular foundations prove inadequate to support the moral weight placed upon them. Without transcendent grounding, human dignity becomes arbitrary assertion rather than recognition of objective worth. Why should rational beings respect irrational beings? Why should capable individuals concern themselves with incapable individuals? The utilitarian answer, that cooperation serves everyone's interest, fails to address situations where exploitation serves the interests of the strong. The Kantian answer, that rational nature deserves respect, fails to explain why rationality creates moral obligations rather than merely prudential opportunities. The crisis of secular foundations creates space for religious resurgence, yet modern religious movements often lack the intellectual sophistication necessary for serious engagement with philosophical challenges. Fundamentalism provides certainty at the cost of rational defensibility, while liberal theology accommodates modern criticism at the cost of transcendent authority. Both responses fail to address the permanent tension between reason and revelation that serious thought reveals. This situation leaves contemporary society suspended between inadequate alternatives, secular foundations that cannot support traditional moral commitments, and religious foundations that cannot withstand rational scrutiny. The resulting instability manifests in culture wars, political polarization, and moral confusion that paralyzes public discourse about fundamental questions of human purpose and social organization. Chapter 6: The Art of Prudent Communication and Noble Lies. Must we always speak the truth, regardless of consequences for individual souls and political communities? This question, raised explicitly in Plato's Republic through the concept of noble lies, challenges modern assumptions about intellectual honesty and democratic discourse in ways that few contemporary thinkers dare to acknowledge. The contemporary crisis of moral authority forces us to confront whether unlimited questioning might undermine the very possibility of decent political life, and whether the philosopher's commitment to truth must be balanced by prudential consideration of truth's effects. Plato's Socrates suggests that political communities require founding myths that cannot withstand rigorous philosophical examination. The myth of metals provides citizens with shared identity and social hierarchy while concealing the conventional character of political arrangements. Modern readers typically interpret this as Plato's endorsement of political deception, missing the deeper question: can any political order survive complete transparency about its foundations? The ancient understanding recognized that political life requires a certain measure of illusion, not because truth is harmful per se, but because most human beings lack the capacity for philosophical life. The modern commitment to intellectual honesty and democratic transparency appears morally superior to ancient acceptance of noble lies. Enlightenment thinkers promised that truth would liberate humanity from oppression and superstition, creating conditions for rational self-government and human flourishing. The democratic faith assumes that citizens can handle truth about political arrangements and make wise decisions based on accurate information. Yet this commitment contains hidden dangers that careful analysis reveals. If philosophical questioning undermines all transcendent standards, religious, moral, political, what prevents the descent into nihilism and tyranny? The modern experience of totalitarian movements suggests that the collapse of traditional authority creates space for more dangerous forms of deception. When people lose faith in inherited moral and political traditions, they become susceptible to ideological manipulation by charismatic leaders who promise certainty and meaning. The result may be not enlightenment but sophisticated barbarism disguised as scientific progress. Contemporary democratic theory attempts to solve this problem through the marketplace of ideas. Truth emerges through free competition among opinions rather than through philosophical demonstration or traditional authority. This solution appears to honor both intellectual freedom and democratic equality while avoiding the need for philosophical or religious foundations. Yet this approach presupposes that citizens possess sufficient education and leisure for rational evaluation of competing claims, and that truth will reliably triumph over error in open competition. When these conditions are absent, as they typically are in mass democratic societies, democratic discourse degenerates into manipulation by skilled propagandists who understand how to appeal to passion rather than reason. The techniques of modern advertising and political consulting demonstrate how easily public opinion can be shaped by those who understand the psychology of persuasion. The result is not rational deliberation but sophisticated manipulation disguised as democratic participation. The responsibility of philosophers and educators in this situation requires careful consideration of the relationship between truth and social order. Should teachers expose students to arguments that might undermine their moral and political commitments? Should scholars publish research that weakens social bonds or destroys beneficial illusions? The classical tradition suggests that wisdom includes knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, how to communicate dangerous truths without destroying necessary foundations for decent life. This prudential approach does not advocate deception but rather graduated disclosure appropriate to different audiences and circumstances. The esoteric art of writing allows authors to communicate multiple levels of meaning, an accessible surface teaching for general audiences and hidden teachings for philosophical readers capable of careful analysis and responsible use of dangerous knowledge. Chapter 7: Recovering the Classical Path to Wisdom. The path forward requires neither nostalgic retreat to pre-modern innocence nor dogmatic adherence to modern prejudices, but rather a sophisticated return to classical sources that can illuminate contemporary problems while addressing legitimate modern concerns. This return is not antiquarian but vital, a recognition that the ancients grappled more successfully with perennial human questions that modernity has obscured rather than resolved. The task demands recovering classical insights about natural right and objective moral standards while honestly confronting modern discoveries about historical variety and cultural difference. The study of Plato's dialogues reveals a model of philosophical inquiry that maintains moral seriousness without falling into dogmatism or relativism. Socratic questioning exposes the inadequacy of conventional opinions while pointing toward higher possibilities for human understanding and flourishing. The method proceeds through careful examination of common beliefs, revealing their internal contradictions and limitations, then guiding the soul toward more adequate understanding through dialectical assent. This approach respects the partial truth contained in conventional opinions while refusing to accept their ultimate adequacy. The Platonic education depicted in the Republic shows how the soul can be gradually turned from shadows toward reality through careful progression from mathematics through dialectic to direct apprehension of the good. This educational program recognizes that different natures require different approaches, that moral and intellectual virtue develop together, and that the highest human possibilities emerge only through long preparation and favorable circumstances. Modern democratic education, by contrast, assumes that all students should receive identical treatment and that intellectual development can proceed independently of moral formation. Aristotelian practical philosophy provides resources for moral reasoning that avoid both relativism and rigid legalism while maintaining objective standards for human flourishing. The doctrine of the mean shows how virtue requires situational judgment that applies universal principles to particular circumstances without reducing moral reasoning to mechanical calculation. The analysis of friendship demonstrates how human relationships can embody objective standards of excellence while respecting individual differences and the variety of human types. The examination of political regimes in the politics reveals how different forms of government serve different human purposes and suit different circumstances, while maintaining that some arrangements are objectively superior to others in promoting human flourishing. This approach avoids both the modern tendency to treat all regimes as equally valid and the ancient tendency to impose a single model upon all circumstances. The medieval synthesis of classical philosophy and revealed religion, exemplified in figures like Maimonides and Aquinas, offers models for addressing the theological-political problem without reducing either pole to the other. These thinkers show how reason and revelation can be mutually supportive while maintaining their distinct integrity and acknowledging the permanent tension between them. Their sophisticated hermeneutics provide resources for reading authoritative texts at multiple levels while respecting both rational inquiry and traditional authority. Yet this return to classical sources cannot be merely imitative. Contemporary circumstances require fresh thinking that learns from ancient wisdom without simply repeating ancient conclusions. The challenge is to recover classical insights about natural right and objective moral standards while addressing modern concerns about diversity, equality, and freedom that reflect genuine moral progress rather than mere prejudice. This work of recovery and adaptation requires a new generation of scholars capable of reading classical texts with sufficient care to discover their hidden teachings while possessing sufficient understanding of modern problems to apply ancient wisdom creatively. The cultivation of this intellectual virtue represents perhaps our most urgent educational task, requiring institutions willing to support slow, careful scholarship rather than rapid production of specialized research. Universities must recover their classical mission of moral and intellectual formation rather than merely providing technical training or ideological indoctrination. Students need exposure to great books that challenge contemporary assumptions while offering alternative possibilities for human flourishing. The goal is not to produce narrow specialists but to form human beings capable of living examined lives worthy of rational creatures who can distinguish between noble and base, just and unjust, worthy and unworthy objects of human pursuit. Conclusion. The moral compass that modern society has lost cannot be recovered through technical innovation, procedural reform, or therapeutic intervention, but only through the patient work of returning to classical sources with fresh eyes and sophisticated hermeneutics that honor both ancient wisdom and legitimate modern insights. The ancients understood what we have forgotten, that human flourishing requires objective standards accessible to reason yet transcending mere convention, and that the cultivation of virtue depends upon understanding human nature and its proper development rather than arbitrary choice or social construction. The crisis of our time is fundamentally philosophical, a crisis of the very possibility of rational moral knowledge that manifests in political confusion, educational chaos, and spiritual emptiness. Yet this crisis also represents an unprecedented opportunity, the chance to rediscover treasures of wisdom that hasty modernity discarded too quickly in its rush toward technological mastery and democratic equality. The choice before us is clear: we can accept the comfortable nihilism of contemporary relativism, or we can undertake the difficult but rewarding journey back to the sources of Western wisdom that still speak to those willing to listen carefully and think seriously about the permanent questions of human existence.